Welcome to Weekend Office Hours with Professor Paul Deneri. My name is Sirish Pulusani. I think we're on episode 3. I'm so happy to have Paul back discussing all the latest things that are happening in Ukraine with the invasion by Russia, and also trying to tie it into the bigger picture, the bigger geopolitical picture, the bigger history picture. So, Paul, thanks for being back. You obviously are one of the foremost scholars on this topic. You wrote the book, Ukraine and Russia, and so your insight is going to be useful as always. And I'm going to start with a question. Francis Fukuyama, who hopefully some of our listeners are familiar with, famous for this essay, The End of History and the Last Man. He said Russia is heading for an outright defeat in Ukraine. What is your thoughts on this?
Well, yeah, I read Fukuyama's essay with great interest. Fukuyama, if nothing else, is good at provoking, right? Saying things very clearly that almost force us to have a conversation. So give him credit for that. I liked what I read in his essay because I want it to be true. But does that mean it is true? This is a reasonable perspective, right? It's a reasonable perspective. He says Russia is, and I'll just quote now, he says Russia is heading for an outright defeat in Ukraine. Russian planning was incompetent, and he goes on from there. And it was based on flawed assumptions. So yes, Russian planning was, well, I don't want to use the word incompetent, but it was quite flawed, and Russia's assumptions were quite flawed, and Russia is, in many important respects, losing the war in Ukraine. But as you know, Sirish, when people come with simple statements, my response is always, well, it's complicated. One of the things that gets the interesting question is what counts as victory or what counts as defeat. I think if we think in terms of what Russia and Putin expected 2 weeks ago when they started this war, I think there's a case to be made that they've already lost. They've already lost in the sense of whatever happens in Ukraine, Russia is now condemned to what I think will be decades of alienation and isolation from the West in general and from Western Europe in particular. And that will set Russia back in an historical way. And so in that sense, I think Russia's already lost in the political sense, right? And I always try to say, I always quote Clausewitz, war is politics by other means. War always has a political goal. And in terms of the political goal, Putin's already lost. Russia's already
because this is not what he expected whatsoever, right? He expected to take Kiev within like 48 hours, prop up his person there. He overestimated the effectiveness of his own military capabilities, probably because he was just getting bad information and all the corruption that was taking place. Mm-hmm. So this is not what was in the plans for him.
That's absolutely right. You mentioned bad information. I think one thing that's become quite clear this week that we might have only speculated about before is we now sort of have concrete evidence that Putin was being lied to by his generals, which is Putin went on Russian television and said there are no Russian conscripts in Ukraine. Conscripts basically being people who have been drafted into the army rather than being people who have signed up. Like we now have in the United States, and what's called the all-volunteer army. And this matters, of course, because conscripts tend to be less trained, less disciplined, and their mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters tend to be a lot more irate about them getting sent into war zones. And but what was interesting about this was the general staff basically had to come out and say, well, there actually are some there. And it's quite clear, we know in the West, that there are Russian conscripts. So that begins to give you some notion of why he might have miscalculated is because he was not getting straight up information. Yeah.
So that seems to be the general direction. That's the sense I'm getting is that there's been this huge miscalculation by Putin in Russia. Yep. It's not going their way. But at the same time now, Putin and Russia, they've kind of escalated, right? I mean, they're targeting a lot. I mean, just even last week touched on this. They're targeting a lot more civilian areas. That devastation of the hospital in Mariupol. The war crimes seem to be escalating.
Yep.
Is this going to just be ongoing week after week, just getting worse and worse? Because what is the other choice for Putin? He's not turning back at this point.
Right. So to come back to Fukuyama, what Fukuyama is predicting is that this is going to become rapidly unsustainable for the Russian army. Right? He says the army in the field will reach a point where it can neither be supplied nor withdrawn. Morale will vaporize. That's speculation, right? Mm-hmm. Again, he's good at being bold, but he also has a track record of not always being entirely. Yeah,
let's bring that up because he is famous for that essay, The End of History. Yep. He essentially argued after the collapse of the Soviet Union that this brings about the ascendancy of Western liberal democracy. That's the ideological endpoint. That we're all going to be kind of peaceful from now on. Is that the general sense? And this was pretty spectacularly wrong, right?
Yes. I mean, I think it's not as wrong as people have made it out to be, but it's also, it also wasn't right. His argument was narrower than I think sometimes people read into it. This phrase "end of history" is so bold, but he takes it from Hegel. And nobody reads Hegel because even in German, Hegel is impenetrable, and translated into English, Hegel is even more impenetrable. I can tell you because I've tried to read Hegel; it's hard. This is a digression, but the woman who tried to explain Hegel to us in graduate school said the only way to really understand this is to get a cabin in Vermont and spend a year. Doing nothing but reading.
I think you did that once, right? I think you've done that before.
If I get a cabin in Vermont for a year, it will not be spent reading Hegel. Trust me. But anyhow, but the argument was about Hegel had this idea that history was moving towards an end, right? That there was progress in history. And that was how he inspired Marx, among others, was this idea that history is headed towards an end and it's a good end. And in that sense, the end of history meant, as Fukuyama saw it in 1989 or 1990, was the historical ideological debates that have persisted for hundreds of years and that really defined the 20th century are over, because nobody anymore is arguing that fascism is the way that we should run a country. And nobody anymore, as of 1989, was arguing that communism is the way we should run a country. There might have been a few, laggards in North Korea or in Cuba, but in that sense, that's what he was arguing. And in an important sense, he was right, which is that increasingly, even authoritarian governments are claiming to be democratic and are holding elections, usually rigged elections, as a way of legitimizing their power. Very few leaders make the argument, right, that they shouldn't be elected, that they should hold power either because their father held power or because democracy is decadent and the powerful should rule by their power. So in that sense, he might still have something.
Yeah, let's talk about that for a moment, because I think it's so hard for people to imagine that actually, like, fascism and even like the totalitarian state that brings on is actually something at one point in history that people supported, right? Like the German people, is that a right conclusion?
Absolutely.
Like they actually supported someone having that amount of power because they needed strong direction.
Yes, and we should say, we think of fascism primarily in Germany, but it really, as a doctrine, originated in Italy under Mussolini, who was in power for about 10 years before Hitler came to power. But there was a fascist party in Great Britain at that time. There was a fascist movement in the United States. And, of course, there was a fascist movement in Spain, which ended up running the country for about 30 years.
What is so appealing? Can you describe it just in general terms? And what is so appealing about fascism in certain moments in history?
So one of the tricky things with fascism is because there are really only 2 or 3 historical examples, and there were lots of people writing about in the 20s and 30s. Nobody exactly ever agreed on what fascism is. But let me start with the root of the term. It's actually a Latin term. And a fasces, actually anybody who runs and has had an inflammation of their plantar fasciitis or has had plantar fasciitis, the fasces is a bundle of tendons, right, running down the underside of your foot. A fasces is a bundle of sticks. And the idea of a fasces is that one stick is fairly weak, but when you put them all together, it's pretty hard to break. And so the symbolism you see with the fasces is a bundle of sticks with an axe head. So it's a weapon that's got a strong handle because it's made of many, not just one. And symbolically, the idea of fascism is that a society is a single organic entity, not composed of individuals. And so for the nation in particular, it's the idea that it's the nation that matters, the collectivity and the strength of the collectivity, not the individual. Now, it went on from there to this sort of ultra-nationalism to therefore generally say, and our nation is better than other nations, and that notion that we're better is validated through violence. And so it was a doctrine that explicitly glorified violence as the right of the strong versus the weak, and as the way in which strength is demonstrated and glorified. And in particular, there was an idea that society at the time was decadent, and we see some echoes of that today. It's not a coincidence that fascism really bloomed in the 1920s and 30s when the world was in the middle of a global depression. And it was seen that democracy wasn't solving the problems and that capitalism was on its way out. The fascists hated or thought that democracy was decadent and its time had run its course, but that communism was an existential threat. And so it was the last thing I'll point out about fascism, certainly in Italy and in Germany in the 20s and 30s, was it had this vision of an ideal future. So the past was decadent, the current rulers are decadent, but there's this glorious future that we're going to build. And you see that in the art and architecture of fascist Germany and Italy.
Yeah. So let's get to Russia on that point, essentially. Are they turning fascist? Are they already fascist? Is that Putin's goal here?
So a colleague of mine at George Washington University, Marlene Laruelle, wrote a great book published last year or maybe the year before. It was called Is Russia Fascist? And it basically said Russia accuses others of being fascist and others accuse Russia of being fascist. But it's all propaganda. And I haven't had a chance to talk to Marlene yet and ask her, well, what do you think now? And my reading of this is Russia is becoming more fascist. In terms of the glorification of violence, Putin has Russia. This conflict is a conflict, and if you see some of the things that the Russian media are saying, they're glorifying war. And so, in that sense, I think Russia looks more fascist now than it did 6 months ago or even 6 weeks ago. The other thing that's happening in Russia now, to take it from a soft authoritarian, you might call it, to a really hard authoritarian, is the complete control over media. And the idea that if you even use the word invasion or war, you're going to be imprisoned. And so that's much more the kind of totalitarianism that Hitler in particular put in place in Germany.
There is some articles that are coming out that are saying that the media and the propaganda machine that Putin has built, there are signs of some sort of breakdown, that certain media personalities might be kind of saying a few things now that might not sit well with Putin, for instance, like that. Do you feel that's the case? Is that happening, or is it just getting more and more propagandistic at this point?
I think what's happening, I mean, there are people who are saying some things, but the people who have those things to say are fairly quickly finding themselves no longer represented on the airwaves in Russia. And so those people have tough choices to make. The Echo Moskvy radio station was closed. Novaya Gazeta, which was a good newspaper for source on Russia politics, basically just they didn't close, but they put a banner on the top of their webpage that basically said, "We're not covering we're not covering this because we can't talk about it." And so they've kind of tried to wiggle their way, but so people are definitely saying we're not going with this, but those people then are not allowed to speak to the Russian people, and so the Russian people are still getting this very, very, I don't even want to call it sanitized. It's just completely fabricated notion of what's going on, and then it's up to them, right, to believe what they want to believe.
Yeah, and it's hard to get a sense of how many people are on either side of that argument as well, right? We're not really getting a clear picture. I mean, it's obvious, from our perspective, the tide is turning a little bit, but like, what does that look like on the ground in Russia, actually? What are the conversations people are having in just households in Russia?
Well, we don't know, but I can tell you one of my friends in Ukraine said to me said, Paul, you wouldn't believe it. I have these relatives in Russia, and they're messaging me saying, don't worry, we're coming to get you, and in the nice sense of we're coming to rescue you. And he says, these are my relatives. These are people I've known my whole life. And they clearly believe this line from Putin that there are fascists in Ukraine and that the Ukrainians need to be rescued from them. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't think that's representative, but I think there's a spectrum, like there is in most countries.
Yeah.
There's a spectrum of people who want to believe everything that Putin says, and so they do. Right? Mm-hmm. And we know people in the United States who they believe what they want to believe. Mm-hmm. And reality and facts aren't going to get in the way with that, because when they encounter facts that undermine their beliefs, they don't change the beliefs. They discount the facts.
Mm-hmm. Right? They just double down oftentimes. Right?
Absolutely, absolutely.
We see that.
We all have some tendency to do that. The psychologists have demonstrated
100%.
That.
100%.
But for a lot of people, I think around the world, this includes Russia, it's become a really powerful phenomenon in terms of rejecting news information that you see as being politically unpalatable.
Mm-hmm. And that's a threat around the world, I think.
Absolutely.
Right? I mean, this is something that was clear over the past few years, even here in the United States. Yeah. I want to shift this conversation a little bit. Gary Kasparov was recently talking on Sam Harris's podcast, and obviously Gary Kasparov, the famous Russian chess master, grandmaster, one of the best ever, but also a really famous political dissident, right? Ever since Putin came into power, he has been outspoken on the world stage about the danger that Putin poses to the rest of the world, and he's done this for for a long time. Right. And in fact, in 2015, he wrote a book called Winter is Coming, laying out these chain of events and essentially making the argument that we're just giving this dude free rein. We're giving Putin free rein, and as long as we do that, Putin will do what he wants. He recently said that he's essentially making the argument that we can't do half measures anymore. He said, you do not compromise with cancer, you cut it out. At the end of the war, it must lead to the collapse of Putin's regime. As long as Putin stays in the Kremlin, there will be no peace. And that being said, the more you read about history, the more you understand the cycle of history. It is oftentimes powerful men deploying their will upon the world. And sometimes the only way to stop that is through counter-aggression. Is it time now to kind of ramp up what our response? And when I say our response, I mean the rest of the free world.
Yeah, so this is a really good question. And Kasparov, I think it's important to reemphasize something you said. Kasparov was right about Putin a long time before a lot of other people were. So in contrast to Fukuyama, he's got a reputation for being right about things, not just being right. And Kasparov's paid a high price, of course.
Yeah.
So I think he's worth listening to. Just as Fukuyama being wrong in 1989 doesn't mean he's wrong today. Kasparov, being right before doesn't necessarily mean that he's right today. But I think that he is, in the sense that Putin has embarked on a path from which there is no easy way back. And that's one of Fukuyama's points. There's no way politically for Putin to walk back this war. Because of the way he set up his government, his regime, his claims to power in the world, you don't even have to appeal to his psychology, which some people would, to say, this is somebody who just losing is not an option. It's very hard, I think, for Putin to see, even if he were inclined, and I don't think he's inclined to say, wow, this turned out worse than I thought, let's walk it back somehow by making some kind of deal with Ukraine. I don't think there's anything about Putin that would do that, but I also don't think there's anything about his model of ruling Russia that leaves room for that. And so in this sense, here's where I absolutely agree with Kasparov, which is that this aggression is only going to be stopped by force. Now, we can have a big debate, and we should, over what the West should do in terms of applying that force without getting us into a nuclear war. But I think anybody who thinks that this is going to end with any other way than wherever it is that the Russian army is defeated on the battlefield, I think is probably still being too idealistic. And I would say, actually, for the last 500 years, with some exceptions, but by and large, the borders of Russia have been determined by where Russian troops end up on the battlefield.
But what does that even look like, though? I mean, the Russian army is massive. The Ukrainian army is not. What does defeat look like? Is it just a war of attrition?
I'm afraid. So we could be headed that way, which is I can imagine this being a war of attrition, and it becomes a contest of back to Fukuyama. Fukuyama says basically the Russian troops are going to give up, or their effort is going to collapse. I'm not sure I agree with him, but here's where I do think he's got an important point, which is that the sort of strategic place to watch right now in this conflict is the morale of the Russian army in Ukraine. To what extent do they want to keep fighting? And then secondarily, to what extent is it possible to keep supplying them on the one hand? And then the other hand, right, is to what extent can the West continue to supply the Ukrainians? Now, Russia is a much bigger country than Ukraine, and it has a much bigger army, but it's about, 4-1. It's not 10-1. And of course, the Ukrainians are fighting for their own land. Mm-hmm. So at least right now, in Ukraine, there's a lot more people fighting for Ukraine than for Russia.
It's an existential threat for the Ukrainians, essentially.
Absolutely.
And so for them, It's a completely different war. And by the way, there is a previous historical pretext for this, right? I mean, this is the Soviet Union engagement in Afghanistan in the 1980s.
Sure.
That there is an argument to be made there that hastened the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, it was just the exhaustion from that drawn-out conflict. Now, at that point, though, they didn't have a leader like Putin, though, this authoritarian, leader who seems to be hell-bent on all costs to just be in power, right?
Well, Brezhnev, who was the leader of the Soviet Union at that time, he didn't get to be the leader of the Soviet Union by being a wimp.
Yeah.
And he had, he had some experience, although it was vastly, vastly inflated by propaganda, some experience as a young leader in World War II. But, the Soviet Union was regarded as this astonishingly powerful and incredibly ruthless power. And I want to say they were incredibly ruthless in Afghanistan. They used anti-personnel mines. They used biological weapons. They used all kinds of things to get after the Afghanis. But in the end, it just didn't work for them. And again, the United States, of course, never fully committed to a war in Afghanistan, or Iraq for that matter. But we, we're not, those things they're not easy to do, to fight outside of your borders in somebody else's territory when they are dead set, when they see it as existential.
Yeah, but what I worry about is, it could be a war of attrition. It could be this drawn out war, but the actual war doesn't end until Putin is dead. And so how does that happen?
Well, we don't know, but your point is well taken, which is I'm not sure that the current level of violence can be sustained for 20 years, but just as the small war that Putin started in 2014 had kind of limped along for 8 years, this conflict, the lines could gel a little bit, or you could begin to get some lines that solidify, and you could have this very messy situation that endures for decades. We tend to think of wars ending, but sometimes wars just kind of linger on. There is a famous conflict that's called the 30 Years' War.
There's a 100 Years' War as well,
and there's
right?
a 100 Years' War, exactly, and the 7 Years' War. So these things don't always end cleanly like World War I and World War II did.
Mm-hmm. No, it doesn't always end with a treaty and these nations getting together. It can be a lot more messy than that. And and so there's been a few things discussed about what, the response. And obviously the sanctions, I think we're kind of going all in with that. The economic repercussions for Russia are going to be massive. But now there's this talk of the no-fly zone, which the Ukrainian president wants. This is a little bit terrifying, right? Because the moment an American plane shoots down a Russian fighter, that's an escalation at a level that does potentially bring about global nuclear conflict, right?
Well, this is of course what people are worried about. I have to say, I watched a presentation yesterday at the Atlantic Council. And Ambassador John Herbst, who's a career Foreign Service officer, not somebody I would think of as an extremist, he was making a pretty powerful case for the no-fly zone. The flip side of that is a group of academics and ex-policymakers released an open letter this week advocating against a no-fly zone. And as an observer and as someone who always tries my best to see multiple sides of things, I would just note that it seems where people are coming down on the no-fly zone is at least partly, not entirely, but is at least partly determined by what they thought about this a year ago, which is the people who were saying a year ago Ukraine should come to terms with Russia and sort of settle along the lines of Minsk are people who are really against the no-fly zone. People who a year ago were basically saying, no, Ukraine should resist and persist are ones who are now in favor. So it's not all based on your evaluation of the no-fly zone. It's also based on your notion of kind of how strongly you're hoping to avoid Russia taking over Ukraine. That being said, let me just say the case against the no-fly zone is clear. If you get American pilots in American planes shooting down Russian pilots in Russian planes, the next thing you expect then, right, is Russia might decide it's got to bomb the NATO bases. Now Russia has attacked a NATO country, and now NATO is at war with Russia, and it seems like that could escalate. The case that Herbst was making, and he's not the only one to make it, is that we should not worry about the Russians escalating because they won't, because they are militarily inferior and they know it. He pointed out that when Russia had some planes shot down by Turkey, Russia's response was not to confront Turkey, but to pretend that it was some rebel group in Syria that had shot them down, so that it wasn't faced with the question of are you going to let Turkey get away with it? Yeah. And the argument is, I'm just again, I want to elucidate the argument because that's my job, I think. The argument is that Russia is not crazy, it's not irrational. They've got a sense of where the military distribution of power lies, and they're not going to escalate a war with NATO because they can't win it.
Yeah, so obviously, like maybe in Iraq that would make sense as far as having a no-fly zone because we knew the Iraq government didn't have the capabilities of nuclear warfare, though, right? That's not the case in this scenario.
That's right. That's right. The other, and I think that's right. And so I actually think, it doesn't matter what I think, but it makes it a very different situation, right? Iraq did not have nuclear weapons, which of course is why the United States didn't want Iraq to get nuclear weapons. I would point out, we haven't talked about this at all, Sirish, that Ukraine, at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union or afterwards, Ukraine had the third largest nuclear arsenal on the planet, and the United States combined with Russia to compel Ukraine to give those nuclear weapons away. And so I think there's an interesting question, both as to whether the United States now has more of a moral obligation to protect Ukraine.
I mean, was that based on the fact that the U.S. also offered protection to Ukraine in exchange for Ukraine to give up those nuclear weapons?
Yeah, the deal that was made was Ukraine gave up the nuclear weapons, and interestingly enough, sent the weapons back to Russia because that was the easiest place to send them to. And the Ukrainians are fairly bitter about that aspect of it as well. Not only did we have to give them up, we had to give them to Russia, and they think they didn't really get the financial compensation they could have gotten. But the argument was, the United States said, we're not going to give you the kind of guarantee that we give our NATO allies, and so there was this much more vague. We could look it up. It's called the Budapest Memorandum, but basically saying we're committed to Ukraine's territorial integrity, right?
Would that have been a deterrent? Ukraine having nuclear weapons, would that have been a deterrent to Putin?
Well, so think back to our conversation. We don't want to provide Ukraine a no-fly zone because we're worried about Russian nuclear weapons. If Ukraine had nuclear weapons, do we think Russia would be attacking it today? I think the answer, it seems inconceivable to me.
Yeah.
Right? But the United States in the early 1990s was not thinking about Russia invading Ukraine. It was thinking about the general situation of proliferation. And the idea that the three countries besides Russia that had nuclear weapons stationed on them, Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan, that all of a sudden you were going to get three more nuclear weapon states, petrified the United States, especially at that time as it was struggling with Iraq and its potential nuclear program, and Iran and its nuclear program, and North Korea and its nuclear program. And so the financial pressure and the diplomatic isolation that was threatened Ukraine if it didn't surrender these weapons was immense. And so if you wanted to justify a no-fly zone today, I would think you would talk both about the commitments that the United States made to Ukraine at that time, and about the identical commitment that Russia made to Ukraine at that time and violated. Right? I think if the United States could say to Russia, this is not a NATO thing. This is a Budapest Memorandum from 1994 thing. You've violated your commitments under the memorandum. We're going to stick with our commitments under the memorandum as a way of trying to isolate the precedent that this would set of Western forces defending Ukraine. To be honest with you, I don't see any chance that the Biden administration is going to go for this.
The public support also, and just to get to that point, because I want to talk about how this situation, how the American response to this situation might have been different if we ourselves haven't been exhausted with two long, drawn-out, prolonged wars, right? It's crazy to think, I mean, in 2001, after September 11th happened, that's how long we've been in Afghanistan. I mean, that's more than half my life. And obviously the pulling out of troops there did not go as planned either. And if it wasn't for those engagements, maybe the moral authority of the United States would be quite different, and our actions would be quite different right now.
Absolutely. You can make a case. You can make a better case for the justification of going into Afghanistan in 1991, in terms of what happened on 9/11 and the fact that those people who organized. I'm sorry, 2001. Sorry, thank you. I'm confusing my wars. So you can make that case because, of course, the United States had been attacked from groups that were on that territory. The invasion of Iraq in 2003 was much more a war of choice, and I write this in my book. I think it's hard to overestimate how much that damaged the United States' credibility around the world, and the extent to which that angered Putin and Russia because of the hypocrisy that they saw. So on the one hand, it feeds this argument of Putin's that the United States is just hypocritical, but I think in the years, say, between 2014 and today, the legacy of that conflict made the Western Europeans in particular much less likely to give the United States the benefit of the doubt when it said, hey, this is something we need to do something about.
It's almost sad because you see this, like the conversations that are happening when you see these war crimes taking place by Putin and Russia in Ukraine. Sometimes the counter argument is like, how is this different than what the United States did to Iraq? And obviously, not to justify that invasion or anything that happened there, but is there any equivocation here between these two incidents?
Well, I think we'd have to get into a pretty detailed discussion of the two incidents. I think the bigger point to me is the argument. There's this famous Soviet propaganda ploy that's known as What-about-ism, right? And that's what we're now doing, right? Is Russia's invaded its neighbor and it's shelling cities, and so we change the subject, right? What about what the United States did? And there's a lot of this going on. The point I would simply make is that if you think what the United States did in Iraq was wrong, then you have to think that what Russia is doing in Ukraine is wrong. The idea that what Russia is doing in Ukraine is okay because of what the United States did in Iraq makes no sense whatsoever, right? The only thing that makes sense is to say maybe people should have been more critical of the United States, and I would subscribe to that. But being more critical of the United States has nothing to do with justifying what is turning into a genocide. So if I sound strident, it's because one thing that irritates me more than anything is thinking that is just on the face of it illogical. This idea that,
and there's a lot of that taking place, and especially
the idea that it was bad to invade Iraq and somehow that makes it okay to invade Ukraine. The Ukrainians didn't invade Iraq.
No, absolutely. I mean, you could definitely hold the opinion that it was a bad decision by the United States, the Iraqi invasion, and at the same time say that there has to be a response from us at this point in some manner against what's taking place in Ukraine.
Yeah, That's the basic point. And then you can, if you want, you can get into parsing behavior. The United States did a lot of nasty things in Iraq and Afghanistan, and that's completely leaving aside Vietnam. But there were always, one of the reasons why the United States struggled so much in Afghanistan and Iraq was because of rules of engagement that tried, and I want to say tried often with a lack of success, to avoid civilian casualties, whereas Russia seems to be using civilian casualties as a strategy of coercion.
Mm-hmm. And intentions matter here as well, right? The intentions,
in terms of international law, they matter a lot.
They matter a lot. In terms of the
law of war, they matter a lot.
Exactly. So I think we just have to make that clear. So that being said, you can make the case that kind of this, excuse my language, but the half-assed response to Putin over the last 2 decades from the rest of the world has kind of allowed him to, just operate on his own terms.
Yep.
That's brought about this catastrophe right now.
Yep.
Apart from supplying Ukraine with weapons, apart from these sanctions, what do you sense are some other good strategies here?
Well, so I want to come back to this question of supplying Ukraine weapons. It seems to me that there's maybe a compromise position beginning to congeal among those who advocate a no-fly zone and those who oppose a no-fly zone. And same thing having to do with this potential idea of sending Polish Soviet-era MiG fighter jets to Ukraine. The argument being that, in fact, there's a lot more weaponry the United States and its allies can provide to Ukraine that might be as effective, certainly more effective than those MiG fighter planes, and maybe accomplish some of the things that a no-fly zone would accomplish. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And so I think that's the biggest thing now. The biggest thing now is say, okay, you don't want to do a no-fly zone. Let's really push the envelope of the weapons. One of the people that was on this Atlantic Council call yesterday that I was on, that I was watching, I watched it later, who's a retired general, was talking about anti-ship weapons, right? Because one of the places where Russia's really having success is in southern Ukraine, and it's because its navy has sort of uncontested access to the Black Sea coast. Mm-hmm. One of the interesting questions I think will be logistically is as those troops move further away from the coast, how successful will their logistics be? But this individual was basically making the case that we should give the Ukrainians some anti-ship weapons and help them with some anti-ship tactics to begin to at least threaten those Russian naval ships off the coast so that they can't operate with total impunity and basically not have to worry about being attacked.
What is the argument against that? What is the argument against just an all-out support of weaponry to Ukraine?
The argument there are some practical arguments which I think I would have to leave to the technical experts. Mm-hmm. Which is there's always arguments about some of these weapons require a fair amount of training to use, and so how quickly can you train people up? Now, my feeling about that is, because I do think this war is going to go on for some time, however long you think it's going to take to train people up, I would say let's get started. That's my opinion. But I think there is this sense, again, that we are afraid of getting involved to a point where Putin decides to escalate. And I think, again, whether one buys the no-fly zone argument or not, I do think there needs to be some clearer thinking about the extent to which the West is going to be deterred by Russia. To what extent are we going to say that we're going to be cautious to the point where we hang the Ukrainians out to dry?
Mm-hmm. I think part of the argument, certainly from a lot of American circles, I mean, this is an argument that has existed since, World War I, World War II, is this isolationism argument. Yep. We should look after our own interests,
yep.
Do us,
yep.
and the world will play its own game. We don't want to get involved in the affairs of Europe, get drawn out into all these conflicts. Now, obviously, the affairs of Europe, they have massive implications for everybody. What's taking place in Russia and Ukraine has massive implications for everybody. But that's the argument, right? And some people are saying, there are war crimes taking place. We need to do this for the Ukrainian people. It's a combination of both that we need it's going to have implications for the United States, and there are war crimes taking place, and we need to do what's right for the Ukrainian people as well, right?
Yeah, I think there are different arguments. There's a strictly altruistic argument, right? Help people who are basically innocent and we're bothering nobody. from being attacked by what we're seeing as quite a brutal power. And then there's a self-interested argument, and the self-interested argument is again, it's the argument from World War I and World War II, which is that we can try to stay out of it, which we did in World War I and we did again in World War II. And inevitably we find it in our interest to get in. And so the question is, do you want to be doing this now over Ukraine, or do you want to be doing it 5 years from now or 10 years from now with a much more powerful, much more aggressive Russia, and now we're doing it in Germany or France or something? Yeah.
And let's talk about the broader implications, because, we've talked about this before, because the only players are not the United States, are not just Ukraine and Russia. Obviously, we have China there. And so how does this play? And one thing I just want to bring up here is it just seems that, like, for instance, China, they have these long-term strategic goals, right? Even Russia to some degree. The United States very recently and the West very recently have seemed very reactive, meaning we're just reacting to the things that are happening around us, right? Instead of looking at broader long-term strategy, being proactive. And so in that context, with China there, like what can the United States do? What are our goals? What are our long-term strategic goals other than de-escalation of this from a worldwide global conflict and helping Ukraine?
Well, I think this is a good question. I think the United States in the West in general, especially since the end of the Cold War and arguments like the end of history, I think we've tended to assume that if we keep the worst from happening, progress will take its natural course. Democracy will spread. People will see the virtues of liberalism. So in that sense, even without Fukuyama writing his book, I think a lot of people were inclined. Right. The whole doctrine of containment, going back to the Cold War, was based on the idea that if we just contained the Soviet Union, eventually it would collapse because our system's better. And so that confidence in our own system, which I think is actually a good thing, allowed the West to be reactive, which is to say we need to simply prevent the worst from happening, and over time, progress, people will see that this is what they want. And of course, the way that the Cold War ended and what happened in the 20 years after the Cold War validated some, but not all of that. Right. As far as what the United States, should do in the big long term. Sorry, I'm sticking my arms out here, but the camera's too far out to see it. What we should do in the big long term perspective is, we need to get our own house in order, which is the power. This is my estimation, right? I'm speaking more as an opinionated person, not as a political scientist here, but the power of the United States has always been, above all, in the power of its idea, its attractiveness. People have been attracted to the U.S. as territory and as a place to live, and of course, people across the world still literally die trying to get here. But also to the model, the freedom, the openness, the cultural vibrancy, and so on. And over the last 10 years. That model has taken a big hit. It took some hits as a result of the Iraq War, but it's taken some hits in terms of our own internal dissension and the sort of culture wars that people now see taking place here, and the flirtation with authoritarianism that really began in 2000, or really became visible in 2016, and we're not quite over with yet. So I am still one of those that thinks if the United States and the West in general are at their best, the force of attraction will do a lot of the work that we need to be done. But there will be times, as there were in the 1930s and 40s, and as there were with the Soviet Union in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, where there are nasty powers out there who the only way to stop them will be with force. And I think maybe we thought that was over in 1989 or 1991, but clearly it's not. And
well said, Paul. And I think in this sense, we'll just go full circle and bring it back to Francis Fukuyama. This is where he might have been right in the sense that Western liberal democracy, as far as bringing the most prosperity for the largest amount of people, with all its problems, with all its issues, it's still probably the best system we have, and it is worth defending that ideal.
I would say about the whole thing what Churchill said. It's probably not politically acceptable to quote Churchill anymore, but he said this about democracy. He said it's the worst possible system of government, except all the other ones.
Except all the other ones, right?
And I tend to agree with you, which is that you don't have millions of Americans trying to emigrate to China. or to Russia. When people get to vote with their feet, they move to Western Europe, they move to the United States, they move to Canada. They don't move to Russia and China.
Yeah, and it can be messy. It's not always, roses or anything else like that. That's part of the process of democracy. But at the end of the day, we have our freedom. We have our freedom of press, freedom of markets, and it's not always this great thing, but it's far better than almost any other scenario.
Well, I think as we're thinking about ideology, I do think it's worth taking seriously. There is, and this has really arisen, really in the last, I would say, 10 years or so, an increasingly unified critique of the whole liberal democratic model, not so much of the capitalist model. And it comes from this perspective that's basically anti-liberal. Not anti-capitalist, but anti-liberal politically. And I think Viktor Orban in Hungary is a great example of it, which is it's against gay rights. It's against multiculturalism. It's against the politics of diversity. It's against women's equality and women's rights and so on. And I actually think of it as, and I think we've talked about this, there's this sort of masculinist backlash or macho backlash against a lot of the cultural politics of contemporary liberal democracy. And that's something that connects Putin, Orban, Bolsonaro in Brazil, and Trump in the United States. Is the idea that the problem is that we've become too soft.
I think that's actually worth discussing in the future because you can make the argument the pendulum has swung sometimes too far in certain directions, and that does bring about the opposite extremist, the rise to power of those points of view, essentially, right? And there's likely some balance here that we do need to talk about. We need to flesh out that thought process a lot more. So we will keep that topic, I think, for a future discussion. Okay. We covered so much. There's a lot more to cover. I just want to end with one last question, which is, how has your worldview or any opinion that you previously had changed over the last 3 weeks since this war has started?
Yeah, this is a good question. Because I wrote a book that, so I put a lot of time and thought into explaining sort of why we got to conflict in 2014 between Russia and Ukraine. And what I'm really asking myself now, especially as I think about revising the book, but also writing a lot of stuff that people have been asking me to write, is in light of what we know now, did we get that wrong? Or did I get that wrong? And in particular, what I'm really thinking about is where Putin is today, is that somewhere he was in 1999 or 2000, and it just took till now for it to come out? That is, he tried all these other things and now he's resorting to violence? Or is there some way in which he has fundamentally changed in the last 5 years? That's the one thing I'm really thinking about a lot, is how do we make sense of this? The other thing I'm thinking about a lot, it comes back to something I said a little while ago, which is there is this sort of existential confrontation now that seems like it's between good and evil, or between people who are going to wage war and kill for what they want and the resistance to that. And I'm not really into sort of categorical black and white, good and evil. But to me, it is quite clear now that this is going to end only on the battlefield. It's going to take military force to end this. And so it pushes you back into this sort of black and white thinking, or saying, yes, violence is the solution, which is something that someone like me, it's almost impossible for those words to come out of my mouth. But when you're confronted by what you're confronted by within Ukraine, as was the case with Hitler in the 1930s, or I would say with the Soviet Union during part of its existence, the only thing that's going to stop it is force. And here's where maybe I was in the same boat with Fukuyama, which is maybe I was hoping that we had gotten over that.
I think we all were, but unfortunately the history of humanity has also been the history of warfare. Right?
Absolutely.
And we could all be naive and optimistic. I certainly am in many scenarios. I grew up in the 90s during these long periods of peace, and this was what my thought process was. but it's become readily apparent that sometimes the only way to stop aggression like this is to have a strong position. I don't know what that looks like. We're not calling for anything. I mean, it's just the bottom line is obviously sometimes it does require a higher response than just letting people do their thing, right?
Yeah.
On that note, Paul, we're going to be doing this once again every weekend, weekend office hours. So we'll be recording again. I would love for people to send in any comments about further discussions. But the bottom line is we just want to kind of paint all these unfolding events into the broader strokes of history and just have these natural discussions. So we hope everybody's enjoying it. Thank you so much, Paul, for joining me today.
Thank you, Sirish. It's always a pleasure.
Right, awesome.
Take care.